Retirement had been uneventful, to say the least. After 40 years of teaching history at the local high school, I was ready for some peace and quiet. My days were now filled with gardening, reading, and the occasional walk around the neighborhood. It was a simple life, but one I cherished. That night, the rain poured relentlessly, a heavy curtain of water drenching everything in sight. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one by the window, with a book in hand and a cup of tea on the table beside me. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling and lightning flashing across the sky. I had always loved storms. They were a dramatic reminder of nature's power. Just as I was about to turn the page, I heard a soft but insistent knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in weather like this. I put down my book and went to the door, my curiosity piqued. When I opened it, a young woman stood on my porch, completely drenched. Her clothes clung to her, and her hair was plastered to her face. She looked as if she had been submerged in water, not just caught in the rain. Her eyes were wide with desperation and fear. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I live across the street. I've locked myself out, and my husband won't let me in." "Of course, come in," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "Let's get you out of those wet clothes and warmed up." She hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. I handed her a towel and a blanket, and she wrapped herself up, shivering. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to make her feel more comfortable. "Emily," she replied, glancing nervously around the room. "I'm Thomas," I said, offering a reassuring smile. "Why don't you sit down and I'll make you a cup of tea?" She nodded and I went to the kitchen. When I returned with the tea, she was sitting on the edge of the couch, clutching the blanket tightly around her. "Here you go," I said, handing her the cup. "Thank you," she said, taking a sip. "I appreciate your kindness." "It's no trouble at all," I said, sitting down in my armchair. "Can I call someone for you? Maybe a locksmith?" She shook her head. "No, it's fine." I nodded. "You can sleep in the guest room. It's more comfortable than the couch." "Thank you," she whispered, and I showed her to the small guest room down the hall. She slipped inside and closed the door gently behind her. I returned to my armchair, the rain still pounding against the windows. I tried to read, but my mind kept drifting back to Emily. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off in my chair. When I woke up the next morning, the first rays of sunlight were streaming through the windows. I got up and went to check on Emily, but when I opened the guest room door, it was empty. The bed was neatly made, and there was no trace of her ever being there. The blanket and towel I had given her were folded neatly on the chair by the window. I stood there for a moment, confusion and unease gnawing at me. I decided to go across the street to check on her. I hesitated for a moment after reaching the house. Hesitantly, I walked up the path and knocked on the door. After a few moments, a middle-aged man opened it. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Hi, I'm Thomas from across the street," I said. "Last night, a young woman named Emily came to my house. She said she lived here and had locked herself out." The man's face went pale. "Emily?" he whispered, his eyes wide with shock. "That's not possible." "What do you mean?" I asked, a sense of dread creeping over me. He swallowed hard, his eyes filling with tears. "Emily was my wife. She drowned 5 years ago, on a night just like last night. I stared at him, my mind reeling. That can't be. She was here. I spoke to her. I gave her a blanket and tea. The man shook his head. I've lived here alone since she died. There must be some mistake. I felt a chill run down my spine. The desperation in Emily's eyes, her soaked clothes, the way she had vanished without a trace. It all made a horrifying kind of sense now. I mumbled an apology and stumbled back to my house, my mind racing. I could still feel the weight of her presence, the desperation in her voice. She had reached out to me, and in some strange, unexplainable way, I had been able to offer her a moment of comfort. As the days passed, I tried to move on, to push the experience to the back of my mind. But every time it rained, I found myself thinking of Emily, of her pale, frightened face and the mystery that surrounded her. I realized that some things are beyond our understanding, that there are mysteries in this world that will never be solved. I always thought road trips were supposed to be fun. Peter and I had been looking forward to this one for months. A weekend getaway to a cozy bed and breakfast in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to escape the stresses of our jobs and spend some quality time together. Peter was a graphic designer, always buried in his work, and I worked in marketing, constantly juggling deadlines and clients. We needed this break. But as we drove along the winding, deserted road, the rain began to fall, and our perfect getaway started to feel less idyllic. The weather had been fine when we left the city, but the further we drove into the mountains, the darker the skies became. By the time the rain started pouring, we were miles away from any town, and the narrow road had become slippery and treacherous. The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield like 1,000 tiny hammers. The wipers struggled to keep up, and visibility was almost non-existent. We slowed to a crawl, both of us on edge. Peter gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "Do you think we should pull over?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. Peter shook his head. "There's nowhere to pull over. We just have to keep going until we find a safer spot." We pressed on, the car inching forward through the storm. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, the car sputtered and came to a halt. Peter tried the ignition again, but the engine refused to start. "Great," he muttered, banging his fist on the steering wheel. "Just great." I pulled out my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. "No reception," I said, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. Peter sighed. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while. Maybe the rain will let up, and we can figure something out." We sat in silence, the rain drumming relentlessly on the roof of the car. Minutes turned into an hour, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Just when I thought we'd be spending the night in the car, headlights appeared in the distance. "Someone's coming," I said, relief washing over me. The vehicle pulled up alongside us, and the driver rolled down his window. He was a middle-aged man with a kind smile and a weathered face. "Need some help?" he asked. "We're stranded," Peter explained. "Our car won't start, and we have no cell reception." The man nodded sympathetically. "Hop in. I'll give you a ride to the nearest town. It's not far from here." Peter and I exchanged a glance. It was risky, but we didn't have many options. "Thank you," Peter said. "We appreciate it." We grabbed our bags and climbed into the back seat of the stranger's car. The man's car was old and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was dry and warm, and that was all that mattered at the moment. "I'm Jack, by the way," the driver said, glancing at us in the rearview mirror. "What brings you two out here?" "We were heading to a bed and breakfast in the mountains," I replied. "Needed a break from work." Jack nodded. "I understand. These roads can be tricky, especially in weather like this." We made small talk for a while, but something about Jack's demeanor began to unsettle me. His questions became more personal, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Peter seemed to sense it too. I could feel his tension beside me. "Do you live around here?" Peter asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Jack's smile widened, but it felt more like a grimace. "I've been around these parts for a long time, seen a lot of things." The vague answer did little to reassure me. As the rain continued to lash against the windows, the atmosphere in the car grew increasingly tense. I glanced at Peter, and he gave me a reassuring nod, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "So, what do you do for a living?" Jack asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "I'm a graphic designer," Peter replied, "and Katie here works in marketing." Jack nodded slowly, as if digesting the information. "Marketing, huh? Must be tough, always having to convince people to buy things." I forced a smile. "It has its challenges, but I enjoy it." Jack's eyes lingered on me for a moment too long before he turned his attention back to the road. "You two seem like a nice couple. Been together long?" 5 years, Peter said, his grip on my hand tightening. Jack hummed thoughtfully. 5 years is a long time. Ever think about what you'd do if something happened to one of you? The question was so out of the blue, so unnerving, that it left us both speechless for a moment. "We try not to think about things like that," Peter said finally, his voice tense. Jack chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Smart. No point in dwelling on the bad stuff, right?" The car fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on us. "Tell me, Katie," Jack said suddenly, his eyes flicking to me in the mirror. "What would you do if you were all alone out here, with no way to get help?" A chill ran down my spine. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I suppose I'd try to stay calm and find a way to contact someone." Jack nodded, a strange smile playing on his lips. "That's a good answer. Always good to keep a level head." He then reached over to the glove compartment and pulled out a weathered map, spreading it out on his lap as he drove. "You know," he said, tracing a finger along the faded lines, "there are a lot of places around here where people can disappear without a trace. No one would ever find them." My breath caught in my throat. "Why are you telling us this?" Jack glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. "Just making conversation. It's important to know your surroundings, don't you think?" Peter cleared his throat, trying to change the subject. "So, Jack, do you have any family around here?" Jack's smile faded, replaced by a distant look. "Had a wife once. She left me, said she couldn't handle the isolation out here." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, though the words felt hollow. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being toyed with. Jack shrugged. "It happens. People come and go. You learn to live with it." The road stretched on, seemingly endless, the rain still hammering down. At one point, he turned to Peter. "Ever think about how easy it would be to just vanish? No one would know where to look. Out here, you're just another face in the crowd." Peter's jaw tightened. "No, I haven't, and I don't plan to." Jack's smile returned, more predatory this time. "Good. It's best to stay grounded. As we neared a small, dimly lit town, Jack's questions became more pointed. "What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you too?" he asked, his tone almost playful. Peter hesitated, then answered, "Probably getting stranded out here in this storm." Jack laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, I'm sure there are scarier things out there. You just haven't encountered them yet." The town's outline emerged through the rain, and I spotted a gas station up ahead. Desperation clawed at my insides. "Hey, Jack, do you think we could stop at a restroom soon? I really need to go." Jack's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought he would say no. But then he nodded. "There's a small town up ahead. We can stop there." We drove in silence for a few more miles, the tension thick in the air. When we finally pulled into the small town, I breathed a sigh of relief. The place was little more than a gas station and a few buildings, but it felt like a lifeline. "Here we are," Jack said, pulling up to the gas station. "Restrooms inside." Peter and I quickly got out of the car, and I felt a wave of anxiety as we walked toward the building. "We need to get away from him," I whispered to Peter. "Something's not right." Peter nodded. "Let's just go inside and figure out a plan." We entered the gas station, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The attendant behind the counter gave us a curious look as we headed for the restroom. Once inside, I locked the door and turned to Peter, my heart racing. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We'll wait here for a bit," Peter said, trying to stay calm. "Maybe we can find someone else to help us." We stayed in the restroom for what felt like an eternity, the sound of the rain muffled by the walls. Eventually, we heard a knock on the door. My heart leaped into my throat, but it was just the attendant. "You folks okay in there?" he called. "Need any help?" Peter opened the door and explained our situation. The attendant, a young man with a friendly demeanor, nodded sympathetically. "There's a motel down the road," he said. "You can stay there for the night. I can call the sheriff's office and let them know what happened." "Thank you," I said, feeling a rush of relief. "We'll do that." We left the gas station and made our way to the motel, keeping an eye out for Jack. Thankfully, there was no sign of him. The motel was run down, but it was a safe haven compared to the stranger's car. We checked in and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and shaken. As we lay there, listening to the rain outside, I couldn't help but think about how close we had come to real danger. We never saw Jack again, and our car was towed to a nearby garage the next day. The mechanic told us it was a minor issue, easily fixed. Peter and I continued our trip, but the incident stayed with us. It was a reminder that even the best laid plans could go awry, and that sometimes the kindness of strangers wasn't what it seemed. We were grateful to have escaped unharmed and learned to be more cautious in the future. Driving home from my friend's place in the early hours of the morning, probably around 2 or 3 a.m., I found myself navigating through a heavy rainstorm. The lack of streetlights made visibility poor, forcing me to drive more cautiously than usual. My home was about 20 minutes away, not a long distance, but in this weather and with the rural spread of houses in the area, it felt much longer. 5 minutes into my drive, I reached a traffic light. I had the red light while a red car on the opposite side had a green light. Strangely, the car was partially in the intersection but stationary, its headlights glaring through the rain. It seemed odd. Perhaps the driver was asleep or experiencing some trouble. When the light turned green for me, I slowly maneuvered around the red car, trying to sneak a glance inside. The rain on my window obscured most of my view, but I didn't see any obvious signs of distress. As I continued down the road, I noticed in my rearview mirror that the red car had turned and started following me. It wasn't broken down after all. I felt a pang of unease, the situation striking me as deliberately staged. The car's headlights grew brighter in my mirrors, indicating it was closing the distance between us. The lights became so intense that they nearly obscured the car itself. A warning light on my dashboard signaled that one of my tires was low on air. It was a common enough alert, but given the circumstances, it felt like more than a coincidence. Glancing back at the red car still tailing me, I saw their headlights practically on my bumper. The tension was palpable, and I was just minutes away from my neighborhood entrance when a new signal appeared. Flat tire. Panic set in. The realization that this was no ordinary incident, that the car behind me had likely caused this, was terrifying. I tried to drive further, hoping to make it closer to home, but the car was now riding on its rims. Reluctantly, I pulled over. To my dread, the red car did the same. In my anxiety, I failed to call anyone immediately, too focused on the movements of the people behind me. 3 doors opened, and 3 men emerged. My heart raced as they approached, 2 on my side and 1 on the other. One of them came up to my window, pointing a gun at me and yelling for me to open the door. Everything happened in a blur. I reached for the door handle, but another man smashed the back window and unlocked the door from the inside. Chaos erupted as they continued yelling at me and each other. The man at the back opened the other door, reached over me, and opened my door from the inside. I raised my hands to show I wasn't a threat, realizing that resistance was futile. The man with the gun yanked me out and slammed me onto the wet pavement. Oddly, my mind fixated on the cold, wet ground rather than the immediate danger of the gun pressed to my head. It was as if my brain was trying to detach from the traumatic reality. After a short while on the ground, one of the men called out, and the guy holding me down hit me in the back of the head, making my face ricochet off the pavement. Numb with shock, I couldn't tell if he used his fist or the gun. Their car doors slammed shut, and they drove away, leaving me dazed and injured. They had taken my phone, so I had no choice but to drive my damaged car home to call the police, further ruining the rims in the process. The police investigation revealed that the men had planted small tire spikes at the intersection I had crossed. Fortunately, I had only hit one, which caused less damage than intended. They likely planned to ambush me as soon as I hit the spikes, but their plan was a success nevertheless. The investigation went nowhere, with no leads on the suspects. Reflecting on that night, I realized just how lucky I was to escape with my life, even if my sense of security was forever shattered.